When a decision comes down from the Supreme Court, people usually rush to see who won and who lost, which side got the advantage, and which justices lined up where. But every once in a while, something far more important happens. A ruling arrives that doesn't split the court, doesn't fracture along ideological lines, and doesn't leave room for doubt about what the Constitution demands. A 9-0 decision is rare for a reason. It tells the entire country that this wasn't about politics, it wasn't about party, and it wasn't about personal judicial philosophy. It was about the Constitution speaking clearly and every justice listening. That unanimity matters more than most people realize. In a time when Americans are constantly told the nation is divided beyond repair, a unanimous Supreme Court ruling cuts through the noise. It sends a powerful signal that there are still core principles so fundamental that disagreement falls away. When all 9 justices agree, the message isn't subtle. The law on this point was pushed too far, or misunderstood too long, or applied in a way that violated basic constitutional limits. This wasn't a close call. This was a correction. What makes this moment even more significant is that the ruling didn't just clarify a technical legal issue. It addressed the boundaries of government power itself. The court was effectively saying that constitutional rights are not optional, not flexible depending on circumstances, and not subject to erosion simply because doing so is convenient. A unanimous ruling tells lawmakers, regulators, and enforcers that the guardrails are real and they exist for a reason. Historically, the Supreme Court reserves unanimity for cases where the constitutional violation is unmistakable. These are moments when the justices, despite their differences, agree that allowing a certain practice to continue would weaken the very structure of constitutional governance. That's why this decision stands out. It reflects not just agreement on outcome, but agreement on principle. It affirms that the Constitution is not a living document in the sense that it can be bent beyond recognition. It lives precisely because its core protections remain intact. This ruling also reinforces something essential about how rights are supposed to function in America. Rights are not privileges granted by the government. They are boundaries placed on the government. When the court rules unanimously, it is reminding those in power that their authority has limits, and those limits are not negotiable. That message carries enormous weight, not just in courtrooms, but in state houses, agencies, and law enforcement offices across the country. Another critical aspect of this decision is how it reshapes public trust in the judiciary. Confidence in institutions has been shaken for years, with many people believing courts simply reflect political outcomes. A 9-0 ruling challenges that cynicism. It demonstrates that when constitutional text, history, and principle align, the court can and will rise above ideological division. That doesn't mean controversy disappears, but it does mean the rule of law remains stronger than partisan pressure. This decision also serves as a warning to future policymakers. When the court speaks unanimously, it closes the door on creative reinterpretations designed to sidestep constitutional protections. It tells legislatures and agencies that pushing boundaries too aggressively will not be rewarded. Instead, it will be corrected, firmly and publicly. That kind of clarity can prevent future overreach before it even begins. And for everyday Americans, the importance of this ruling goes beyond legal doctrine. It reaffirms that the Constitution still functions as a shield, not just a symbol. It reminds people that their rights do not depend on which party controls Congress, which administration holds office, or which crisis dominates the headlines. A unanimous court is saying that some freedoms are foundational, and when they are threatened, the response will be decisive. There is also a broader cultural impact. When the Supreme Court speaks with one voice, it has the power to reset the national conversation. It forces commentators, officials, and institutions to acknowledge that certain debates are settled, at least at the constitutional level. That clarity reduces confusion, strengthens compliance with the law, and reinforces the idea that rights are not subject to constant renegotiation. Perhaps most importantly, this ruling underscores the idea that constitutional interpretation is not about expanding power, but restraining it. The court didn't invent new rights here, it reaffirmed existing ones. It didn't rewrite the Constitution, it read it. That distinction matters because it preserves the balance between liberty and authority that defines the American system. A unanimous Supreme Court ruling doesn't happen often, and when it does, it deserves attention. Not because it creates winners and losers, but because it reminds the nation of something deeper, that the Constitution still stands, still limits power, and still protects individual rights when it matters most. For years, the Second Amendment has been treated differently from every other constitutional right. It has been balanced, negotiated, narrowed, and reinterpreted in ways that would never be tolerated if applied to free speech, religious liberty, or due process. What this ruling does is draw a clear line and say that the right to keep and bear arms does not exist on probation. It is not a suggestion. It is a constitutional guarantee, and guarantees are not meant to be endlessly reweighed based on political trends or shifting opinions. The court made something unmistakably clear here. Constitutional rights are not ranked by popularity. The Second Amendment does not need to justify its existence to regulators or survive interest-balancing tests that change from case to case. When a right is written into the Constitution, the burden is not on the citizen to prove why they should have it. The burden is on the government to prove why it can limit it, and that burden is now far heavier than it was before. What's especially important is how this ruling changes the legal framework itself. Instead of vague standards that allowed courts to uphold restrictions simply because they seemed reasonable or well-intentioned, the court reinforced that historical understanding matters. The question is no longer whether a regulation feels sensible today, but whether it aligns with the Constitution's original boundaries. That shift may sound technical, but its impact is massive. It closes the door on creative justifications that slowly chipped away at the right while claiming to respect it. This decision also addresses a long-standing contradiction. For decades, officials insisted they respected the Second Amendment while simultaneously treating it as an exception to normal constitutional rules. Other rights were presumed protected unless clearly abused. The Second Amendment was presumed suspect unless carefully controlled. This ruling rejects that double standard outright. It restores the principle that a right explicitly protected by the Constitution deserves full respect, not conditional approval. There's also a message here for lawmakers. Regulation does not mean elimination, and safety does not mean surrender. The court isn't saying that government has no role at all, but it is saying that role limits. Those limits can no longer be stretched simply by invoking public interest or administrative convenience. If a regulation interferes with the core of a constitutional right, it must clear an exceptionally high bar, and vague fears will no longer suffice. For everyday citizens, this ruling offers something that has been missing for a long time: clarity. Conflicting lower court decisions created a patchwork of rules where the same right meant different things depending on geography. That uncertainty undermined confidence and turned a constitutional guarantee into a legal gamble. By reinforcing a stronger judicial shield, the court brings consistency back into the equation and reminds people that rights are not meant to shift every time a new policy memo is written. The ruling also rebalances the relationship between citizens and the state. A constitutional right exists precisely because the framers understood that power, once centralized, tends to expand. The Second Amendment was designed as part of a broader system that assumes liberty must be actively protected, not passively allowed. By strengthening judicial scrutiny, the court is reinforcing that philosophy and reminding the government that its authority flows within defined boundaries. Critically, this decision doesn't elevate one right at the expense of others. Instead, it restores the idea that all rights stand on equal footing. The Second Amendment is no longer treated as an outlier or an inconvenience. It is recognized as part of the same constitutional fabric that protects speech, privacy, and due process. That consistency strengthens the entire Bill of Rights, not just one provision. This ruling will also shape future legal challenges. Courts can no longer default to deference when reviewing firearm regulations. They must engage seriously with constitutional text and history. That shift changes incentives. It discourages overreach before it happens and encourages lawmakers to craft policies at respect constitutional limits from the start, rather than relying on courts to clean things up later. Perhaps most importantly, this moment reaffirms a simple but powerful truth. Rights only matter if they are defended when it's uncomfortable to do so. Protecting popular freedoms is easy. Protecting contested ones is the real test of constitutional commitment. By issuing a unanimous ruling that strengthens the Second Amendment's protections, the court has shown that constitutional fidelity still outweighs political pressure. This decision doesn't end debate, but it does end confusion about where the Constitution stands. The Second Amendment is not a privilege granted by the state. It is a right the state is bound to respect. And that line has now been drawn unmistakably clear. At the heart of this ruling is a reminder that the Fourth Amendment was never meant to be optional, even in an age of expanding government authority and advancing technology. For too long, the promise that people should be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects has been slowly diluted by arguments about efficiency, safety, or modern necessity. This decision pushes back against that erosion and makes it clear that constitutional protections do not fade just because the tools of enforcement have become more sophisticated. The court recognized something essential. Power grows quietly. It expands through exceptions, through temporary measures that become permanent, through practices justified as reasonable until no one remembers what unreasonable once meant. The Fourth Amendment exists precisely to stop that process. It draws a line and says there are places government authority does not cross without justification, oversight, and accountability. This ruling reasserts that line at a moment when it was in danger of disappearing altogether. What makes this especially significant is the context in which these issues arise today. Surveillance capabilities are broader than ever. TA collection is easier, faster, and often invisible. Enforcement actions can happen without a knock, without notice, and sometimes without a warrant that truly reflects individualized suspicion. The court made it clear that constitutional rights are not suspended simply because the methods used to intrude have changed. The principles remain the same, even when the technology does not. This decision rejects the idea that generalized concerns can replace specific justification. The Fourth Amendment was designed to protect people from being treated as suspects by default. It demands that the government explain why intrusion is necessary in each case, not rely on broad authority or administrative convenience. By reinforcing this requirement, the court restored the amendment to its proper role as a barrier against unchecked power. There is also an important signal here for law enforcement and regulatory agencies. The ruling does not accuse them of bad faith, but it does remind them that good intentions are not enough. Constitutional compliance is not measured by outcomes alone, but by process. Even efforts aimed at safety or order must operate within defined limits. This decision clarifies that those limits are not flexible suggestions, but enforceable rules. For ordinary people, the impact of this ruling is deeply personal. Privacy is not an abstract concept. It's the ability to live without constant monitoring, to move without being tracked, to exist without the assumption of guilt. When the court strengthens Fourth Amendment protections, it reinforces the idea that freedom includes the right to be left alone unless there is a legitimate reason otherwise. That principle is foundational to a free society. The ruling also corrects a dangerous trend in constitutional interpretation, where courts were sometimes asked to weigh privacy rights against government interests as though they were equals. The Constitution already made that judgment. It placed limits on government power precisely because those interests would always expand if left unchecked. This decision restores that original balance and reminds the country that rights are not meant to be bargained away incrementally. Another critical aspect is how this ruling affects future cases. By reaffirming strong Fourth Amendment standards, the court has provided clear guidance to lower courts. It reduces the likelihood of fragmented interpretations and reinforces consistency nationwide. That uniformity matters because constitutional rights should not depend on geography or judicial philosophy. They should be stable, predictable, and enforceable everywhere. This decision also strengthens public confidence in constitutional protections at a time when many feel increasingly exposed. When people believe their privacy can be invaded without meaningful oversight, trust erodes. Trust in institutions, in law enforcement, and in governance itself. By reasserting Fourth Amendment limits, the court is not weakening authority, it is strengthening legitimacy. Power exercised within constitutional boundaries is power that can be trusted. Perhaps most importantly, this ruling reminds us why the Fourth Amendment was written in the first place. It was born out of lived experience with arbitrary searches and unchecked authority. The framers understood that liberty could not survive if privacy depended on the goodwill of those in power. This decision honors that understanding and applies it to the modern world without diluting its meaning. The Constitution does not promise convenience, and it does not promise efficiency. It promises freedom secured by limits, and this ruling makes clear that those limits still stand. This ruling doesn't strip authority away from law enforcement or regulators, but it does something just as important. It reminds them that authority has edges. For a long time, The boundaries between enforcement power and constitutional restraint have been blurred, often in subtle ways. Small exceptions became routine practices, temporary measures turned permanent, and over time the balance quietly tilted toward convenience over constitutional fidelity. This decision pulls that balance back where it belongs. The court is sending a clear message that enforcement power is not self-justifying. It must operate within constitutional lines that are clearly drawn and strictly respected. The idea that the ends can justify the means has no place when fundamental rights are involved. No matter how well-intentioned an action may be, if it bypasses constitutional protections, it cannot stand. That principle is not new, but it has been reinforced here with unmistakable clarity. What this means in practice is accountability. Agencies can no longer rely on broad authority, vague standards, or internal policies to excuse overreach. When power is exercised, it must be defensible under constitutional scrutiny, not just administratively approved. This ruling makes clear that shortcuts are no longer acceptable substitutes for lawful process. The Constitution is not an obstacle to effective governance, it is the framework that gives governance legitimacy. There's an important distinction here that deserves attention. This decision does not accuse enforcement institutions of acting in bad faith. Instead, it recognizes a structural problem that emerges whenever power expands without firm boundaries. Systems naturally push toward efficiency, speed, and control. Rights exist to slow that process down, to require justification, and to force restraint. By redrawing those lines, the court is reinforcing a system that protects both liberty and lawful authority. For regulators, the message is equally direct. Rulemaking does not grant permission to rewrite constitutional limits. Agencies exist to implement laws, not to stretch them beyond their original scope. This ruling closes the door on interpretations that quietly expand regulatory power at the expense of individual rights. It insists that constitutional questions cannot be buried under technical language or procedural complexity. This moment also reshapes incentives going forward. When agencies know that courts will enforce constitutional boundaries strictly, behavior changes. Policies are drafted more carefully. Enforcement strategies are reevaluated. Legal counsel takes a more prominent role earlier in the process. That kind of discipline doesn't weaken institutions, it strengthens them by preventing abuses before they occur and reducing the need for correction after the fact. For the public, this ruling restores a sense of fairness in how power is exercised. It reinforces the idea that no one is subject to arbitrary treatment simply because authority exists. People are not data points, suspects by default, or obstacles to administrative goals. They are rights-bearing individuals, and those rights demand respect at every stage of enforcement. That recognition changes the dynamic between the state and the citizen in meaningful ways. It also reinforces transparency. When enforcement actions must meet clear constitutional standards, explanations matter. Decisions must be justified, not merely executed. That openness builds trust, and trust is essential for any system that relies on public cooperation. Authority exercised without accountability breeds resentment. Authority exercised within constitutional limits earns legitimacy. This ruling further aligns enforcement practices across jurisdictions. Inconsistent interpretations had allowed similar actions to be treated differently depending on location. That inconsistency undermined confidence in the rule of law. By clarifying constitutional boundaries, the court promotes uniformity and predictability, ensuring that rights are protected consistently rather than selectively. There is also a long-term cultural effect. When institutions are reminded that their power is constrained, it shapes how future leaders approach governance. It encourages respect for limits rather than experimentation with them. Over time, that mindset becomes embedded, reducing the likelihood of systemic overreach and preserving constitutional norms for future generations. Ultimately, this decision reinforces a foundational truth. Power is safest when it is restrained. The Constitution does not exist to hinder justice, but to ensure that justice is carried out without sacrificing liberty. By reaffirming clear boundaries for law enforcement and regulators, the court has strengthened both freedom and the rule of law, reminding everyone that authority endures only when it respects the limits placed upon it. This ruling does more than resolve a single dispute or clarify a narrow legal question. It sets a direction. It tells the country how constitutional rights will be treated moving forward, not just in this case, but in the many that will follow. When the Supreme Court speaks this clearly and this unanimously, lower courts listen. Lawmakers adjust and institutions recalibrate. That's how lasting change happens in a constitutional system. Precedent matters because it shapes behavior long before a case ever reaches a courtroom. When judges know there is a strong, unified standard, they are less likely to stretch interpretations or rely on flexible tests that dilute rights. This ruling establishes a firm reference point, one that will guide decisions involving government power and individual liberty for years to come. It doesn't invite experimentation with constitutional boundaries, it discourages it. The long-term impact of this decision will be felt in how future cases are argued. Attorneys will no longer be able to rely on broad claims of public interest or administrative necessity alone. They will have to confront constitutional text, history, and limits directly. That raises the quality of legal debate and keeps the focus where it belongs, on whether government action respects the rights it is bound to protect. This ruling also influences legislative behavior in subtle but important ways. When lawmakers understand that courts will not defer to overbroad or loosely justified restrictions, they are incentivized to draft laws with greater care. That means clearer language, narrower scope, and a stronger respect for constitutional boundaries from the outset. The result is better governance, not weaker authority. There's a cultural shift embedded in this moment as well. For a long time, rights were often framed as obstacles to progress or efficiency. This decision pushes back against that narrative. It reinforces the idea that rights are not barriers to a functioning society, but the foundation of one. When institutions internalize that principle, policy debates become more grounded, more disciplined, and ultimately more legitimate. The ruling also strengthens the role of the courts as guardians rather than managers. It reminds the judiciary that its responsibility is not to weigh policy preferences, but to enforce constitutional limits. That clarity restores balance between branches of government. Courts check overreach without governing. Legislatures legislate without overstepping, and enforcement operates with defined boundaries. Each branch stays in its lane, and liberty is preserved as a result. For the public, this decision has a reassuring effect. It signals that constitutional rights are not dependent on the political climate of the moment. They don't expand and contract with election cycles or public opinion. They endure because they are anchored in a document designed to outlast trends. That stability is essential in a time of rapid change and constant uncertainty. This ruling also sets a tone for future Supreme Court decisions. It demonstrates that unanimity is still possible when constitutional principles are taken seriously. That example matters. It encourages future courts to seek clarity over compromise and principle over convenience. While disagreement will always exist, this decision shows that shared constitutional commitments can still prevail. Perhaps the most important legacy of this ruling is what it says about the relationship between freedom and power. It affirms at liberty does not survive by accident. It survives because institutions are willing to enforce limits, even when doing so is politically uncomfortable or administratively inconvenient. This decision reinforces that responsibility and places it squarely where it belongs. In the end, this ruling reminds the nation that the Constitution is not self-enforcing. It depends on courts willing to defend it, officials willing to respect it, and citizens willing to understand it. By setting a clear precedent and reaffirming fundamental rights, the court has strengthened the framework that keeps freedom intact.